My name is Daniel Harper, and for the past 16 years, I led the Southeastern Sales Division at Langston & Company, publishing headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina. I wasn't flashy. I didn't rely on algorithms or engagement dashboards. I built our pipeline the old way, over coffee tables, long phone calls, handwritten notes, and showing up at someone's office even when the weather was awful. That's how we turned a dying division into the engine of the company, generating over half its revenue by last year. Before we begin, if stories like mine speak to you about loyalty, quiet strength, and the cost of being underestimated, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this channel. Your support helps stories like this continue to be told. 6 months ago, Langston's board hired a new CEO, Madison Keller, a tech executive from Seattle with no publishing background. She came in with buzzwords like optimization, digital first, and disruption, and surrounded herself with consultants who barely looked up from their tablets. I stayed focused on results. I brought in record numbers last quarter. Still, I could feel it shifting, the silent meetings, the empty glances. And then, on a rainy Monday morning, her assistant knocked on my door. "Ms. Keller would like to see you in the conference suite at 2. His voice was low, like he already knew what was coming. I walked in and saw her waiting, along with someone from HR and another face I didn't recognize. "Daniel," she began with that polished calm, "your methods are no longer aligned with our company's direction. We need modern leadership." She didn't say you're too old or you don't fit the image, but she didn't have to. I nodded, thanked her, and left without a fight. 16 years, closed in 16 minutes. I said nothing. But what she didn't understand was this. Publishing isn't built on dashboards. It's built on trust, and trust doesn't live in a spreadsheet. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. While the rest of the team was at lunch, I quietly packed up my things. A few framed photos, a worn leather notebook, and a stack of business cards I never needed to look at because I already knew the numbers by heart. 16 years of building something real, all reduced to a cardboard box. When I reached the parking garage, I sat in my car for a long time. The rain tapped against the windshield like it was keeping time with my heartbeat. My phone buzzed beside me. 3 missed calls from Edward Rowe, president of Mariner Press, our largest client. He'd already heard. I started at Langston when it was still called Carolina Literary Associates, a scrappy regional firm with less than 25 people. I left a high-paying position at Brentwell Publishing in New York because I was tired of watching books be treated like commodities. Stories are personal, and so are the people who write them. Robert Langston, the founder, hired me over lunch at a diner off I-85. He said, "I don't care about your resume, Daniel. I care if you can sit across from a publisher in South Carolina and know their anniversary date and what their next release means to them." That's how I was trained. That's what I believed. I spent the next 5 years rebuilding the Southeast Division from the ground up. I put 80,000 miles on my car in the first 2 years alone. I went to backroad print shops in Alabama, tiny poetry presses in Mississippi, and family-run educational publishers in the hills of Kentucky. I didn't just sell books. I learned names. I attended weddings. I brought flowers to funerals. I stayed late and arrived early because I believed in what we were doing. When Robert retired and his daughter Emma Langston took over, things changed, but not drastically. Emma respected the roots. She gave me space. But when she stepped down last year due to health issues, the board brought in someone completely outside the world we knew. That someone was Madison Keller. It didn't happen all at once. First, there were unfamiliar consultants popping into sales calls, Then new hires with titles like Client Experience Technologist, who didn't seem to know the first thing about editorial schedules. I tried to stay focused. I told myself it was just a phase. But the ground was shifting beneath me, and I hadn't realized how far until it gave way completely. I looked down at my phone again. Another call from Edward. I didn't answer. I needed a moment. Not to grieve, but to remember. Because this wasn't the end of my story. It was just the end of a chapter. The signs had been there. I just hadn't wanted to see them. 6 months before Madison called me into that boardroom, Grace, my assistant director, stopped by my office. She had that tight look around her eyes, the one that meant she was holding something back. "Daniel," she said carefully, "they've asked me to start attending leadership huddles with the digital engagement team, without you." I forced a smile. "Sounds like they're trying something new." She didn't smile back. "They're calling it an exploratory restructure. There's talk of forming a separate digital sales group, and maybe phasing out the traditional division." I laughed it off, tried to play the seasoned mentor. But that night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was afraid of change, but because I knew where it was heading. Still, I kept showing up, taking client calls, attending school plays with longtime partners, doing what I'd always done. But the shift got more obvious. They assigned 3 new hires to my team, none of whom reported to me directly. Their titles were vague. Digital Experience Strategist, Publisher Metrics Analyst. They asked odd questions in meetings, never looked up from their tablets, and kept requesting CRM access to accounts that I had personally managed for years. One day, I found out through a forwarded email that Mariner Press, a client I had personally brought on and nurtured for over a decade, had been reassigned. No one even told me. Edward, my client, my friend, called me the next day. "Some young guy named Brent just introduced himself as our new point of contact," he said, puzzled. "What's going on over there, Daniel?" I didn't have an answer. "Just a reorg," I muttered, trying to sound calm. But it wasn't just a reorg, it was an unraveling. The next week, Willow and Tide Publishing, another longtime partner, emailed me to say they were confused by the conflicting messages they were getting. Apparently, a junior associate from the digital team had told them their traditional discount tier was being phased out. I hadn't even been looped in. I called Madison's office to clarify. Jason, her assistant, told me he'd pass along the concern. It wasn't concern. It was a warning shot. My instincts told me the board was no longer interested in the people who knew the territory, who could walk into a room and read a client's mood by the way they stirred their coffee. They wanted dashboards, data, disruption, not trust. And now that I'd been removed, I was realizing just how much of what we built was already slipping. Not just numbers, but relationships. Those quiet, unshakable threads that had held our clients close through market crashes and industry shifts. They were unraveling it all and pretending it was innovation. The morning after I left Langston, I sat alone in my home office with the blinds still drawn. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with a silence that didn't feel restful. It felt abandoned. My inbox was full. 32 unread messages, 17 missed calls. I hadn't told anyone yet, not even Caroline, my wife, who was visiting our son in Asheville. I needed time to breathe, to gather the fragments of what had just happened. But the call that finally made me pick up wasn't from a colleague or a recruiter. It was from Edward Rowe. "What the hell happened, Daniel?" he demanded without preamble. "They're going in a new direction," I replied. my voice flatter than I intended. He let out a bitter laugh. You were the direction. You understand that, right? You're the only reason Mariner stuck with Langston through those down years. We didn't trust the brand. We trusted you. I didn't know what to say to that. So I didn't say anything at all. I met with that new guy, Brent, yesterday, Edward continued. 40 minutes of charts, slides, social listening metrics. Not once did he ask me about the new titles we've got lined up, or the historical fiction series you knew meant everything to us. Not once. I closed my eyes. That fatigue, the one that doesn't come from lack of sleep, settled in again. It was the exhaustion of being misunderstood, of watching everything you'd built be redefined as obsolete. They'll adjust, I mumbled. No, they won't, Edward said firmly. Because people like that don't think they have to. They bring in their formula and expect the world to shape itself around it. After we hung up, I opened the email from HR I had avoided since yesterday. My severance package, 6 months' pay, 90 days of health insurance, a non-disparagement clause, and a non-compete that barred me from working with Langston's client base for a full year. I nearly laughed. They thought a document could erase decades of relationships. That paper could substitute for loyalty. And then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it was Natalie Chen from Brightwell Editions, another longtime client. When I answered, she didn't ask how I was. She simply said, "We heard. And when you're ready to talk about what's next, give me a call." By nightfall, I had heard from 9 more. Names I knew like family. Voices that carried more than just business. They weren't calling for contracts or strategy. They were calling because something had shifted. Not just in the company, but in the industry. And they didn't want to be left in the hands of strangers with slideshows and no memory. I sat on the porch that evening, sipping a glass of bourbon, watching the sky fade to that deep Carolina blue. And I kept thinking, maybe being let go wasn't a punishment. Maybe it was a signal. A quiet but firm reminder that the way I did things, relationships over reach, trust over trends, still mattered. Maybe even more than ever. By morning, the idea had rooted itself like a stubborn weed I couldn't pull. It had started as a flicker, something barely there, floating between frustration and clarity. But as more emails poured in from clients, each one echoing the same sentiment. We trusted you, not them. That flicker turned into something firmer, heavier. A possibility. They'd let me go because my methods didn't fit their sleek new narrative. Because I showed up in person instead of logging in. Because my client records were scribbled in ink, not tagged in a CRM. They called that obsolete. What if they were wrong? What if everything Langston Publishing had dismissed, relationship building, memory, trust, wasn't a weakness, but the very foundation that held the industry together? What if the future wasn't some sterile, metrics-driven algorithm, but a return to something more human? I called Benjamin Weiss, my attorney for the last 12 years. He picked up on the second ring. Daniel, you all right? I've got something I need you to look at, I said. My severance agreement. There's a non-compete clause. I want to know how far it really goes. He whistled low. So it's true. They let you go. They did. He didn't ask if I was angry. He didn't have to. I wasn't. Not in the usual sense. What I felt was sharper than that. Disbelief sharpened into determination. They had tossed out loyalty like it was an outdated plug-in. Later that afternoon, Benjamin and I met in his small office just south of downtown Charlotte. He'd already reviewed the documents. This clause won't hold, he said, sliding the papers back to me. They overreached. Too broad, too long, and too vague. It's the legal equivalent of a shotgun blast in the dark. I raised an eyebrow. So, I could start something new? You could, he nodded. But they'll still come after you. Even if they don't win, they can drag you through months of legal noise. I stared at the papers, then out his window at the gray skyline beyond. What if I don't reach out to anyone directly? What if I just exist, available, and the people who know me, the ones who want to work with me, come on their own terms? He smiled. That's a different story entirely. That night, I registered Harper & Gray Publishing Advisors as a legal entity. No website, no press release, no LinkedIn announcement. Just a structure. Simple, quiet, and capable of receiving business. I didn't want revenge. I wanted to help the people I'd spent my life working beside. I wanted to build something they wouldn't see coming, not because it was loud, but because it made too much sense to ignore. 3 days after filing the paperwork for Harper & Gray, I got a call from Edward Rowe. There was no small talk. I heard you've set up shop, he said. Word travels fast. In this business, like wildfire. He paused, then added, I need help, Daniel. Langston's new team is steering us toward the academic catalogs. But I know my readers. Historical fiction is our backbone. They don't want textbooks. They want stories. I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to help, but because I knew the stakes. Edward, I'm still sorting through legal logistics. I'm not asking for a long-term contract, he said quickly. $15,000 for 2 months of strategic guidance. No overlap with Langston's current services. I'll word it carefully. You'd just be helping me make smarter decisions. It was a generous offer, and more than fair. But I told him I needed time. That same evening, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I nearly let it go to voicemail. I didn't. Daniel? The voice was cautious. Grace, my former assistant director. Can we meet? Not at the office, she added quickly. Someplace off the radar. We met at a quiet coffee shop near the edge of Freedom Park, somewhere we used to go before budget meetings back when things still made sense. She looked older than she had a month ago. Tense, alert. It's bad, she said as we settled into a corner booth. They gave me your job, but I'm just a face. Every major decision is coming from the digital strategy group, and they're dismantling everything, every system, every process you built. They're erasing it all. I stayed silent, letting her talk. They reassigned your clients, installed a mandatory CRM no one knows how to use. 3 senior reps have already quit. And Edward? He's stopped returning calls. Willow and Tide threaten to walk. The projections are in free fall. I exhaled slowly. And Langston? They're calling it expected turbulence, she said, then leaned in. But that's not why I'm here. From her bag, she pulled out a sealed envelope. Client contact list, personal numbers, emails, updated as of last week. I stared at it on the table between us. I'm not asking you to use it, Grace said quietly. But if you don't take it, someone else will. They're watching you, Daniel. Legal had a meeting yesterday. They're afraid you're going to poach accounts. They're laying a trap. But the clients, they're not loyal to Langston anymore. They're waiting on you. She stood, sliding the envelope forward. We never met today. And then she walked out. I sat there for a long time. The coffee had gone cold. I didn't touch the envelope. I knew exactly what they wanted me to do. Use the list, make a move they could weaponize in court, prove their paranoia right. But if I had learned anything in 16 years, it was this. Real leverage doesn't come from desperation. It comes from discipline. When I left the coffee shop, the envelope remained on the table, untouched. A month passed. I didn't reach out to a single client from Langston's roster, despite the growing list of voicemails, texts, and emails I received every day. I deflected politely. Timing isn't right. Still reviewing things. But the truth was simpler. I wasn't afraid of their legal department. I just wasn't going to let them dictate the shape of my next move. Instead, I focused on the edges of the industry. Small university presses, literary agencies, nonprofit publishers, the ones who weren't on Langston's radar but needed help navigating a marketplace that was changing too fast and too impersonally. These weren't legacy accounts. They were scrappy, underfunded, and overwhelmed. But they reminded me of why I got into this business to begin with. I wasn't trying to build an empire. I was building a lifeboat for those who still believed in books as conversations, not commodities. Then, something unexpected happened. I got an email from Harold Breckman, chairman of Langston's board. It wasn't sent from a corporate account. Just a short message. Would you be willing to meet? Privately, off-site. Curiosity got the better of me. We met 2 days later at a quiet restaurant tucked behind a golf course in Matthews, the kind of place old money goes to have discreet conversations. Harold was already seated when I arrived. 2 glasses of scotch poured, untouched. Daniel, he nodded. Thank you for coming. I imagine this isn't a social visit. No, he admitted. It's not. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Things at Langston haven't gone as projected. Revenues are down. Client retention is in free fall. The transition team's strategy has backfired. I said nothing. He studied me carefully. You're not surprised. I'm not, I replied quietly. Publishing was never about interfaces or funnels. It's about people remembering why they trusted you in the first place. He nodded once. The board agrees. Madison's position is no longer secure. Then came the real reason he'd asked to meet. We'd like to offer you a new role, Chief Revenue Officer, above Madison in the structure, full autonomy to rebuild the client relationships, double your previous salary, full board support. I looked down at the amber liquid in my glass, but didn't drink. The offer was everything they thought I wanted. Power, position, vindication. But I also heard what wasn't said. They didn't want me because they suddenly saw the value in trust. They wanted me because they were losing too much money to ignore it any longer. This wasn't a rescue. It was a retrieval. I didn't say no immediately. I simply said, I need time. But in my gut, I already knew. They had made their choice, and so had I. I didn't take long to decide. The next morning, I replied to Harold Breckman's offer with a brief, polite email. Thank you for the conversation. I've given it thought, and I'll have to decline. I wish Langston Publishing well. His reply came within minutes. A revised offer, higher compensation, more autonomy, a note about rebuilding legacy relationships. I didn't answer. Instead, I made 3 phone calls, quietly, deliberately. The first was to Edward Rowe. I'm ready to talk about that consulting agreement, I told him, but I'd like to propose something different. I'm listening, he said. I won't consult exclusively for Mariner Press. Instead, I want to build something collaborative. A group of independent publishers who share knowledge, tools, and market access. No contracts, no bureaucracy, just trust and shared purpose. And I'll be the connector. He was silent for a beat. How many have you spoken to? You're the first. There was another pause, this one softer. Because I was your biggest client. No, I said. Because you were the first one to call when they let me go. And because you never forgot what this business is supposed to feel like. I'm in, he said. And I know at least 4 others who will be too. My second call was to Natalie Chen at Brightwell Editions. She didn't hesitate either. In fact, she added a new idea. A shared digital platform, something small publishers could use to compete with larger houses without giving up their independence. The third call was to Benjamin Weiss. I need to make sure this new plan doesn't violate the non-compete, I told him. He listened, took notes, and responded a few hours later. You're in the clear? He confirmed. You're not working for Langston's clients. You're creating something new, something they can choose to join. It was a subtle distinction, but legally, it meant everything. Within 2 weeks, the foundation was in place. We called it the Harper Publishing Network. 7 founding members, some who had already left Langston, others who were preparing to let their contracts expire. Each contributed a modest amount to an operational fund that would support infrastructure, strategy sessions, and my own modest salary. We weren't trying to become a competitor in the traditional sense. We were building a counterbalance, a cooperative that respected independence while amplifying shared strength. No one appointed me CEO. I didn't want the title. I was the facilitator, the bridge. We rented a small office in Dilworth, far from the downtown skyline and the Suits who thought innovation came in quarterly decks. I hired 2 people, a 20-something with a knack for social media and a recently retired publishing ops manager who knew how to make things run without overcomplicating them. There were no headlines, no announcements, just a slow, steady current of energy moving beneath the surface. By the end of the first month, we had 10 members. Langston didn't notice yet. But they would, because something real was taking shape. And this time, it was built on the one thing no algorithm could replicate. Loyalty earned. 2 months after launching the Harper Publishing Network, we had outgrown our modest space in Dilworth. We moved into a renovated brick warehouse near South End. Not because we were trying to make a statement, but because the old place couldn't hold the momentum anymore. We weren't advertising, we didn't cold call, and we definitely didn't pitch. But word spread. Fast. Clients didn't come to us because we were the loudest. They came because they were tired of being managed by spreadsheets, of being onboarded by strangers who didn't care about their catalog, their voice, or their values. What we offered wasn't a product. It was clarity. It was respect. And slowly, Langston began to notice. It started with whispers. Panicked emails from their junior staff to our newer members, trying to re-engage dormant accounts. Then came the internal reshuffles, the half-hearted return to relationship-based servicing memos. And finally, the legal team. I got a call one evening from Grace, my former assistant director, now quietly keeping me informed. They know what you're doing, she said. Veronica's furious. She's talking about legal action. We've done nothing wrong, I replied. I know that, she said. But she doesn't care. There's a board meeting tomorrow. They're reviewing the quarterly earnings. She hesitated. I'm thinking of leaving, Daniel. And I wanted to ask, would there be room for someone like me? I smiled. Not out of satisfaction, but because I'd known this moment would come, not just for Grace, but for everyone who still believed in the version of this business that Langston had tried to erase. Come by the office, I told her. We'll talk. The next morning, the industry's quarterly earnings reports hit the trades. Langston Publishing had reported a 47% decline in revenue compared to the previous year. Their client churn rate was the highest in company history. Their stock dipped nearly 20% by the close of day. I didn't celebrate. I didn't post a statement or make a call. I spent the afternoon in a roundtable strategy session with 13 members of our network, mapping out our presence for the upcoming Chicago Publishing Conference, our first formal appearance as a collective. We weren't trying to dominate the conversation. We just wanted to remind the industry that relationships weren't relics of the past. They were its backbone. Just before I left the office that night, my phone rang, a number I didn't recognize. "This is Daniel," I answered. "Mr. Harper." The voice on the other end was clipped and formal. "This is Patricia Lane, speaking on behalf of Langston Publishing's board." I didn't respond. "We're calling to notify you that your non-compete agreement has been officially waived, effective immediately." She paused. "Additionally, we've authorized legal counsel to issue a cease and desist notice regarding what we believe to be interference with existing client relationships." I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I asked calmly, "Have you spoken directly with your clients, Patricia?" "Not through surveys." "I mean, have you actually sat down with Edward Rowe? With Natalie Chen?" She hesitated. "That's not relevant to—" "It's the only thing that's relevant," I said. "They didn't leave because I started something new. They left because you forgot what they needed. And I remembered." There was a long pause. Then, "I'll inform the board of your comments. Good day, Mr. Harper." The call ended, but the story didn't. Langston's cease and desist letter never came. But what did come 3 days later was something far more telling. 3 days after that clipped call from Langston's board representative, the headline broke across the Charlotte Business Ledger and every major trade publication in the industry. Langston Publishing CEO resigns amid financial downturn and client exodus. The article cited strategic misalignment and leadership transition. But everyone who had been paying attention knew the truth. Madison Keller had failed, not because she lacked intelligence, but because she lacked understanding. And in publishing, understanding is the currency, not data, not automation, but people and their stories. I didn't read the article more than once. There was no satisfaction in it, no vindication that felt sweet, just confirmation that all those long miles I'd driven, all those names I'd remembered, all the quiet loyalty I'd earned over 2 decades hadn't disappeared when they erased my badge. They had just changed form. By then, the Harper Publishing Network had 23 member publishers. We'd moved into permanent offices, an airy, light-filled space in a refurbished warehouse near Fountain Square, the kind of place where stories could breathe and people felt grounded. Our members weren't just from the Southeast anymore. We'd welcomed publishers from the Midwest, the Northeast, and even a small poetry press out of Oregon. We didn't call ourselves a movement, but the press did. One article in Publishers Weekly called us the Relationship Revolution. Another in the New York Times labeled us a masterclass in integrity-led disruption. I hadn't set out to disrupt anything. I had just wanted to keep doing the work the way it was meant to be done. And then the most ironic call of all came. It was Harold Breckman again. "Daniel," he said, "I won't take much of your time. We have a new interim CEO, someone who understands the industry. The board is exploring possibilities, including the idea of Langston joining your network." I almost laughed, but I didn't. "That's not how we work, Harold," I replied evenly. We're not absorbing big corporations. The publishers who've joined us did so because they were trying to get away from the exact structure you represent." He was quiet, then offered a second option. "Perhaps a partnership arrangement." "I can bring it to our advisory council," told him, already knowing how the vote would go. I hung up, set my phone down, and walked across the open floor of our new office. No corner suites, no glass doors. Just people at their desks, collaborating, asking questions, caring. Grace looked up from her workstation. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Langston wants in." She blinked, then let out a soft laugh. Talk about a full circle. That afternoon, I drove out to Freedom Park and sat on the same bench I used to go to when the weight of corporate pressure felt like it might crush me. But this time, I wasn't carrying that weight. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to prove. Just the peace that comes when the dust settles, and you realize the thing you thought broke you was actually the start of something more honest, more human. Sometimes, getting fired is the best thing that ever happens to you. Not because it fuels revenge, but because it sets you free to build something real. The invitations started coming quietly, one by one. First, a request to speak at a panel during the Chicago Publishing Conference. Then, a virtual roundtable for independent press owners. And finally, an email from Ashland University, inviting me to guest lecture in their publishing program for a course titled Sustainable Models in Modern Literature. I almost said no. Not because I wasn't honored, but because I wasn't sure I had anything new to say. I'd spent most of my career in the margins, behind the scenes, helping others get their stories to the world. I wasn't used to being the one standing at the front of the room. But something in me had shifted. Not ambition, not pride, maybe just clarity. So I said yes. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in a lecture hall that smelled faintly of old paper and coffee, facing 30 students who hadn't yet been told their ideas were impractical. They looked at me like I had answers. I didn't. But I had a story. I told them about the handshake deals, the 6-hour drives to meet a press that barely had heating in winter, the handwritten notes, the funeral flowers, the thank you letters. And I told them about getting fired. About what it feels like to be told your instincts are outdated, your experience irrelevant. About sitting in your car with everything you own in a box and thinking, maybe that's it. Maybe I've become a relic. But I also told them what happened next. I told them about Edward Rowe, Natalie Chen, and Grace. About people who believed in the quiet things, the unrecorded loyalty, the earned trust, the patience it takes to build something that doesn't scale fast, but lasts. Near the end, a student in the second row, bright-eyed, mid-20s, arms crossed thoughtfully, raised her hand. "Mr. Harper," she asked, "if you could go back and change anything, would you?" I thought about that, and I answered honestly. "I wouldn't change the firing," I said, "because if they hadn't pushed me out, I'd still be working to fix a system that was already broken. I would have kept patching holes instead of building something new. Sometimes you don't walk away because you're brave. You walk away because someone finally locks the door behind you. And it turns out that's the only way you were ever going to see what was outside." The room was quiet for a while after that. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was explaining the past. I felt like I was preparing someone else for the future. Later that night, back at the office, I found a note taped to my desk, handwritten, just 3 lines. "Thank you for reminding us that this work still matters, that we still matter. Grace." I sat in my chair, holding the paper. It wasn't validation. It was something gentler, something rarer. A reminder that in a world chasing speed and data, meaning still had a place. And so did people like me. Some days, I still wake up at 5:30 out of habit. I don't have to anymore. There are no morning sales meetings to prep for, no dashboards to comb through, no quarterly projections looming overhead. But the rhythm of those years never fully leaves you. So instead, I make coffee and walk to the window of my apartment overlooking Fountain Square, watching the city come alive before the noise sets in. I still carry a leather notebook, still jot down names, notes, half-formed ideas I might never share. It's not for efficiency, it's for memory, for presence. At Harper Publishing Network, we've grown slowly, intentionally. We're now 31 members strong, with 2 more set to join before spring. We've hosted our first collaborative retreat, launched a shared seasonal catalog, and partnered with a small logistics firm in Chattanooga to improve indie press distribution without burying anyone in platform fees. We've done it without a marketing agency, without venture capital, and without a single corporate slide deck. Instead, we've done it the old way. By listening, by remembering, by showing up. Earlier this week, I had lunch with Edward Rowe at a small diner just off Route 77. The same one where we'd first negotiated Mariner's expansion 10 years ago. He ordered the same chicken pot pie. I didn't say anything, but he noticed I remembered. That's what matters in this work. The details. The effort. I never thought I'd see this kind of publishing again, he told me. Neither did I said. But I'm glad we were wrong. Before I left, he handed me an envelope, a handwritten thank you note and a check for a donation to help support newer, smaller members of our network. It's not much, he said, but I want to make sure this thing keeps going after us. That night, I stayed late at the office. Most of the lights were off, the soft hum of a printer somewhere in the distance. I walked past our shared workspace and stopped at the bulletin board where our members had pinned photos, book launches, bookstore meetups, signed author copies, dog-eared catalogs with sticky notes. At the center was a quote someone had written in Sharpie on a piece of cardboard. We build with trust. We grow with care. It wasn't corporate. It was real. And as I stood there, I realized something. I hadn't just built a company. I'd helped rebuild a standard. A reminder that legacy isn't always about scale. Sometimes it's about staying small enough to care, long enough to matter, and strong enough to endure when the noise fades. Sometimes, getting pushed out isn't the end. It's the door no one told you you needed, until you finally had the courage to walk through it. It was a Thursday morning when I got the email. The subject line was simple. A thank you from the Langston family. At first, I thought it was a mistake, or maybe a formality. But when I opened it, the message was short, sincere, and deeply human. It was from Eliza Langston, Robert's widow, the woman who used to send handwritten holiday cards to every division head before the company grew too big to remember names. She'd heard about what we were building. She'd seen the articles, the quiet return to values her late husband had once fought to preserve. She didn't want a meeting or a favor or even recognition. She just wanted to say thank you for honoring what Robert stood for, even after the company he built had forgotten. I sat at my desk for a long time after reading it. Not because it made me emotional, though it did, but because it reminded me of how far we'd drifted and how worth it the return journey had been. That afternoon, I walked down to Wendell's Books, a little independent shop just 2 blocks from our office that had become a regular meeting spot for members of the network. Inside, the owner, Jillian, was restocking a display of debut novels from our partner presses. She smiled when she saw me. "Hey, "You've got a visitor in the back," she said. I found Grace at a corner table, sipping black tea and flipping through a catalog mock-up. She looked up, grinning. "We just signed our 32nd member," she said. "A poetry press out of Oregon. They said they've never felt this supported, ever." I nodded, took a seat, and pulled out my notebook. We spent the next hour discussing layout changes, author spotlight ideas, and a new mentorship pairing we'd set up between a New Jersey children's imprint and a startup press in Kentucky. It didn't feel like business. It felt like stewardship. Later, as we stepped outside, the winter air crisp and clear, Grace paused. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "Langston?" She nodded. I thought about the early years, the road trips, the quiet late-night planning sessions with people who actually loved books. The feeling that what we were doing mattered. "I miss what it used to be," I said. "But I don't miss what it became." We stood there for a moment longer before heading back toward the office. The city buzzed softly around us. Horns in the distance, the rhythm of passing footsteps, the faint sound of a street musician tuning his guitar on the corner. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I wasn't fighting for relevance. I had become what I never set out to build. A keeper of a tradition that no longer needed defending, just remembering. And in this quiet return to purpose, I had found something I hadn't felt in years. Home. This morning, I walked into the office earlier than usual. The sun had barely cleared the skyline of Fountain Square, and the streets were still quiet, save for the distant hum of delivery trucks and the first scatter of footsteps from the bakery across the way. I unlocked the door, turned on the lights, and stood for a moment in the stillness. The space looked different in the early light, softened, grounded. The walls weren't lined with trophies or corporate plaques. Instead, they held framed book covers, notes from readers, sketches from debut illustrators, and a hand-painted quote from one of our first network members. "Make it personal, or don't make it at all." I walked past Grace's desk, past the shared conference space where two of our team members had left a whiteboard half full of ideas for next quarter. Everything we'd built here, every system, every process, every collaboration, had one thing in common. It started with trust. Trust that was never earned in boardrooms or policy decks. It was built in silences respected, names remembered, phone calls returned, even when there was nothing to gain. At my desk, I found a small stack of handwritten thank you cards from 3 recent members who had just joined from across the country. One of them wrote, "We didn't know community like this still existed in publishing. You made us believe again." I took a breath. Deep. Steady. I had no 5-year exit strategy. No IPO coming. No one waiting in the wings with an acquisition offer. And for the first time in my life, that felt exactly right. Because what we were doing here wasn't about scale or headlines. It was about remembering what mattered when the world told us to forget. If you've made it this far in the story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for caring. And if this journey, Daniel's journey, resonated with you, please consider supporting this channel. Hit the like button, subscribe, leave a comment, or share it with someone who still believes that relationships, loyalty, and legacy still matter. Because they do. We don't always get to control how we exit one chapter, but we can always choose how we begin the next. And sometimes, the quietest rebuild becomes the most lasting revolution of all.